Welcome to Lecture 2, The British Invasion, in which we're going to shift our focus away from all the other European empires and focus mostly on Britain, but I will give you a comparison to France in this lecture so that you can see the way the British model differs. Let's start first with Nouvelle-France, New France, which was limited to what today we would think of as Canada and the Mississippi Valley. They explored North America in the 16th century, before the British really got a foothold on the Atlantic coast. And what the new French colonies discovered was that they could make a lot of money in furs. Particularly beaver furs, which were in high demand in Europe for hats and coats because they're water repellent properties. So the new French settlements tended not to be very large because you don't need a big footprint on the land in order to acquire furs, as long as you can get the Indians to do the fur hunting for you. And that is indeed what happened. Because the French were willing to pay such good money to get these beaver skins, the fur industry grew dramatically and led to wars among the Indians because they're both competing for the same furs in order to sell them to the French. So outbreaks of violence among Indian folks, as illustrated in this drawing here to the right, shows increased during the 16th and 17th centuries. When Indians got access to European weapons, guns in particular, it made Indian warfare more deadly. And at one point, the Iroquois almost entirely wiped out an entire group, their rivals, using their European technology and their desire to get furs. As far as the French relationship to natives goes, it was far less brutal than the Spanish, since it was not based on settlement and using the Indians' labor in a slave kind of way. Which is not to say that the French don't have Indian slavery, because they do. The fact of the matter is the French had a smaller population, so they couldn't be quite as intimidating. French traders intermarried with native peoples in order to gain access to Indian communities and control over fur trading opportunities. French priests actually went and lived with the Indians, so you've got one guy in your Indian community rather than a whole bunch of Frenchmen in their fort. And this overall tended to make relations with native peoples slightly better, even though at no point did the French think of themselves as the equals of the Indians. Europeans are always going to think that they're better than native folks. This is a detail of a map from 1715 showing the beavers at work in the area around Niagara Falls. The beaver skins are incredibly in high demand in Europe and will make the French quite a bit of money once they get access to them by buying them from Indian peoples. The upshot of relations between Indians and the French, as well as Indians and other Indians, is increased levels of warfare and conflict, in which the French ally with certain groups of Indians against other groups. And it can make for very confusing study to try to figure out who the French are tied to at any particular given time. Eventually, the French are going to try to work out a way of keeping the peace, but that'll come in another lecture that we'll talk about in the next time. So the map shows here where you can find the French in the middle of the United States, Canada, anything connected to the Mississippi River. You see all these forts and these areas here, which eventually will become British once the British defeat the French. The Spanish in New Mexico, California, Mexico, and in Florida, and then eventually the British will take over the Atlantic coast. When the English finally get in on the colonization movement, they're late. They have to overcome lack of state financing, religious and political conflict in England itself. But when they finally do get involved, their model is going to be quite different from both Spain and France. The English see the New World largely as a place to colonize for settlement of surplus people. And in doing so, that means that they're going to create spaces for English people to live, extract resources, send those back to England so England makes some money. But that means that there are people coming to the colonies who are going to be relatively poor and not interested in sharing the space with native peoples at all. So colonization ultimately for the English is going to be based on making a profit. England wants to make money. Now they slide a little bit of religion in there as well. In the English, think of themselves as promoting the Protestant as opposed to the Catholic agenda. And you do see some colonies founded by English people for the purposes of religious liberty and new visions of religious liberty in new societies. Ultimately, though, whether it's for making a profit or for religion, English colonists are not interested in incorporating Indians into their world. The Indians are not welcome to be in the English way of life. The English will trade with natives. They will live side by side with natives. A few conversions will happen, but ultimately the English have almost this disgust of native peoples, and they're not welcomed to really integrate into English society. The first place where the English put their model into practice is in the Chesapeake, which is today Virginia and Maryland. 1607, they found the colony there at Jamestown for profit, for making money. And eventually they discover that their best bet for making money is tobacco. The colony almost starves to death, but eventually they discover that there's a noxious weed that they can grow. People like to smoke it. They get addicted, get lung cancer, and die, and yet everyone still wants this wonderful, wonderful New World product. Making your colony built around this agricultural product requires that you also have labor. And at first, the English built their labor supply on indentured servitude, which involved allowing your laborers to be poor English people who can't afford to come to America, who are willing basically to sell themselves into temporary slavery. So in some ways, indentured servitude is a form of unfree labor, but it's by choice, or at least by some kind of a choice. Eventually, the English will shift over to race-based slavery, but we'll talk about that in another lecture. Either way, a large labor supply is needed to make Virginia profitable. At first, Virginia is heavily male-dominated. Men are coming to seek their fortune, to make their way. Very few women. Tends to be very violent. No towns really to speak of except Jamestown. So it's, as I used to tell folks, sort of an early American frat house. It's kind of wild and crazy, which does lead to violence with the natives. The Virginians do not see native peoples as equals, and they think native peoples exist to make, English life better. So they make constant demands for corn, for help on native peoples. Native peoples increasingly see the white men as dangerous and threatening. And so there's actually 2 outbreaks of violence that almost destroy the Virginia colony in 1622 and 1644. By 1619, these crazy, violent, male-dominated frat boys in Virginia are given their own powers to be self-governing. That is, they're allowed to make some rules for themselves by meeting in what's called a House of Burgesses. It's basically a legislature. By 1624, though, the colony is put under the control of the English crown. So the King of England gets the ability to decide, which laws he will let the Burgesses have and which laws he won't let them have. As long as the colony is making enough money for England, however, the English are going to kind of leave Virginia alone. Here's that noxious weed everybody's so hot on in Europe. Virginia was such a deadly place. You can see in this chart just how much people died from disease, from violence, Indian attacks. Most of it disease. In 1607, they land with 104 people. 1608, they've only got 38 of them left. 1609, 300 more people show up, so they've got 338. By 1610, 60 of those people are left. And in this time period, things are so bad that they're eating leather, rats, and each other, actually engaging in cannibalism just to stay alive. Between 1610 and 1624, 10,000 people are sent to Virginia. And by 1624, at the end of that year, only 1,200 of those people are alive. Virginia is a death trap in its first few years. But that death trap manages to hold on and grow from Jamestown, located here, into a series of plantations and farms that spread inward along the rivers. So these aren't cities, these are farms, these are plantations. Everyone grows their tobacco, goes down to the river, puts it on a ship, and sails off to England. Here's an illustration of one of the most famous of the Indians who encountered early Virginia. This would be Pocahontas, as you know her from the Disney movie, Matoaka, or Rebecca, as she eventually became named. Here she is at age 21. She did marry a Virginian, John Rolfe, who brought tobacco production into the colony. Her father was Powhatan, the chief, the paramount chief of the Powhatan Indians. This illustration sort of makes him out to be a king, status regis Powhatan, quando prefectus Smith captivus illidaretur. So this is John Smith being brought to Powhatan. And in some ways, you could think of Powhatan as like a king, but not exactly, because Indian society's governance was not the same as the British model of things. Here's an illustration of the massacre of 1622, the Opechancanough massacre. Opechancanough was the brother of Powhatan, and he decided that the Virginians needed to be eliminated because of their demands on Indian peoples, their threat to Indian peoples. This illustration is very much propaganda. As you can see, it's designed to make you sympathetic to all the people getting murdered. Meanwhile, this guy over here, who apparently cannot hear a single thing, none of these screams around him are reaching his ears. He's just like chopping wood, as he's about to be stabbed in the back. So that's a pretty good indication of the propagandistic nature of this illustration. So you might be thinking, why conflict with the native peoples? What's going on to sort of make this conflict? Well, for one, I've already said that the English come with a model of taking land and making it theirs. And, that's pretty much if I walked over to your house and said, your property is mine now, you'd probably be angry about that. But there are all kinds of other cultural differences that lead the English and the Indians not to get along, to dislike each other. Those cultural differences have to do with things like gender. Many native peoples are matrilineal, so you are your mother's child and you belong to her family, not your father. Because after all, you can only be really sure that you are your mother's child since she gave birth to you. In many Indian societies, women do the work of agriculture, so they do the farming. And in Europe, that's a man's job. In Indian societies, many men hunt, which in Europe, that's seen as the sport of the leisured and the lazy lords who have, free time to go out hunting. So Europeans get this impression that Indian men are lazy and work their women, in the fields, which is not exactly accurate because men do help out with farming chores, even as they're bringing in protein from their hunting. Indians don't have a concept of personal ownership of land, so many of these nations of Indians do not see land as something that can be owned, bought, sold, possessed. It can be controlled, it can be parceled out, you can divide it up and share it, but when you die, it doesn't belong to you, then you can then turn it over to your family. The purpose of land is to use it for the benefit of your people, to keep alive. And Europeans come in and say, well, I see you're not using that, therefore I'm going to take it. And the European way of making that claim clear was to put a fence around it. For them, fences pretty much said, this is my property, this belongs to me. And Indians didn't understand that. So Europeans will steal these unfenced properties, which Indians clearly say belong to the people, the Indian peoples, but they're not going to go around putting fences over it because it's hunting lands. Indians were seen as irreligious, seen as heathens, seen as not true followers of the faith or religion that Europeans wanted. And that also troubled and bothered and disgusted many English people. Indians, when they engaged in diplomatic relationships with Europeans, often demanded presents. Not in the sense of, like, I'm not, I demand you give me something, so I will like you. It's almost a sense of the exchanging of gifts creates a bond between people that promotes honest and open discussion. We've established a friendly relationship, so you bring me a gift, I give you a gift. And this gift giving helps make sure that our diplomacy is going to be honest. And Europeans are sort of taken aback, like, why do we need to give you presents? You don't deserve presents. Indians became dependent on European goods. They actually became very savvy consumers of European fabrics, knowing exactly what they wanted and what they liked. And that often led to conflict as well. When Indians would hunt and then take their skins to be sold, Europeans would try to cheat them, and Indians would feel angry about that. Indians would demand access to certain goods that Europeans didn't want to share. And so these goods could become a point of tension as well, of what you were allowed to trade with native peoples and what you're not supposed to trade. And then disease disrupted native communities, and natives reacted angrily in many cases to the idea that somehow the Europeans were attacking them. Some native peoples also reacted with a sense of the Europeans have special spiritual powers where they're being protected from the disease. Here's an illustration of Indian women farming. Notice it's drawn by a European. And so therefore the women are not shown in sort of an Indian way, they're shown in a European style, so that European audiences would look at it and go, ah, yes, this makes sense to me. I see these Indian women. This is a cloak of Powhatan's. It's on tan buckskin with illustrations of animals and a man and perhaps towns out by the side. We think this is potentially a map of Powhatan's empire. Not really sure. So the Indians do have a concept of territory, just not personal property that is owned by individuals. As Virginia grew and expanded, many of those indentured servants were being pushed further and further to the west. And as they did so, their hope was to get a farm, grow tobacco, and eventually become a big landowner like those other guys were, way down there in those nice houses on the coast. But as the number of indentured servants becoming free increases, and as tobacco production increases, we are seeing a greater risk of the tobacco market collapsing. And in fact, that's what happens in 1660. After 1660, social mobility, the ability to rise up and to be better and to move up into a higher social class, becomes extremely limited for former indentured servants. The richest 15% of the population pretty much dominate Virginia society after 1660. So indentured servants are kind of feeling frustrated that they've worked, they survived, they got their freedom, and yet they're probably still going to be stuck in poverty just like everybody else. So they're kind of ripe for someone to play up their frustrations. Enter into this situation is a wealthy elite man named Nathaniel Bacon, who's not quite as wealthy as he could be, but he's related to the governor of Virginia, and he sees Virginia as a place to make his fortune, except he can't get into the Virginia's governing squad, the leadership of Virginia. He's got squad goals, but can't make it happen. And so he goes out to the frontier and he talks to all of these indentured servants, and he realizes there's deep resentment. And one of the deep resentments is that all of these frontier servants feel like Indians are getting away with murder and destruction and theft, and that the government of Virginia is not protecting former indentured servants from Indian attacks. So Nathaniel Bacon whips these guys up into a rebellion against the elites of Virginia, and eventually in September of 1676 he falls ill to dysentery, but not before he and his men engage on a murderous attack of Virginia society, killing off people with his interracial, interclass army. And that scares the holy living daylights out of the rich white elite people of Virginia, who decide, wow, these servants, well, they're super duper upset that they're not socially mobile and they don't have rights. Maybe we should give them some more rights. So they do. They increase political power among former servants, and at the same time, they begin a slow transition towards using African slaves instead of indentured servants. And I say slow transition because it's not going to be until 1700 that you will see a number of Africans in Virginia. So indentured servitude will continue to limp on for quite some time. So what makes this slow transition happen? Well, for one thing, death rates declined. When people aren't dying as quickly as they used to, it makes sense to own a human being for life, because They're not going to die, probably. And once you buy a slave by about 1700, you can expect to get 21 or 22 years of work out of them. The supply increases as well, thanks to British involvement in getting control over supply contracts for slaves from Africa. There are more slaves available, and with more slaves available, it's easier to buy someone now for a lot cheaper. And Virginians go through a process of defining slavery as a permanent inheritable status that you get from your mother. The earliest Africans in Virginia were probably indentured servants, and many of them were freed as well as became slave owners themselves or owned the indentures of other people. But by the 1660s and 1670s, pretty much the assumption was that if you were African, you were a slave. So race becomes a proxy for your economic condition, for your lack of freedom. And not only is it an indicator of your status, it's inheritable. So if your mom is a slave, you're a slave. And that's Nathaniel Bacon. Here is crude housing for settlers, typical of what you would see in Jamestown in Maryland at the time. So small little villages, really no cities at all to speak of in colonial Virginia. Everything farms and tobacco, farms and tobacco. Contrast Virginia to our next group of English settlers, the Puritans, who migrated from England, particularly Yorkshire, East Anglia, and the West Country, in the 1630s to New England, Maryland, Virginia, as well as Bermuda, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean. About 20,000 of these folks went to the West Indies, but another 20,000 went to New England. And their story is going to be quite different because they are going to recreate the English world as they know it in New England, but with a twist. So you see all of these names here: Haverhill, Hampton, Ipswich, Salem, Newton. These are all English names: Oxford, Medfield, Plymouth, Barnstable, Wethersfield, Waterbury, Wallingford, Guilford, Derby. All these are good old English names. So these people are intent on keeping a strong English identity. But that identity is going to be shaped by their religious values. For the Puritans, New England was supposed to be a city on a hill, a place for where they would make the perfect society as a model to reform England and to make England better for everyone else. So their model for colonization is not profit, it's faith, it's religion. Puritans are theologically Calvinists, which means that they believe in predestination. God knows who is going to be saved, and only God knows. Humans have no role in becoming saved and going to heaven. Puritans believe in the covenant, the idea that all believers must faithfully work together to show God's love and God's mission. And if they covenant together, then God will covenant with them. So very strong sense of community bond. Strong sense of congregationalism, where the local church has all the power. The local church decides who becomes a member, who is a believer, who is not. You have to be a member of the local church, in fact, in order to even vote in New England. So the Puritans don't come for money making, they come for faith. And as they come for faith, they also come as families, because they're not interested in just getting rich. They want to bring everyone over and create the perfect little world, their own utopia. This does have some side effects. The Puritans, because they're family-oriented and because they're in New England, tend to have lower mortality. In fact, Puritan children and grandchildren live to see their grandparents. They have more tight-knit towns where everybody is closer together and knows each other rather than spread out on farms. Homes are highly patriarchal, so it's a male-dominated culture, which they do have in common with the rest of English colonies. The economy of the Puritans, they do need to make money because everybody needs an income. Everybody needs some way to be successful economically. It's dependent on farming, though it's not as successful because the soils are rocky and the growing season shorter. Fishing, timber, trade, very big on trade. And as a reason, as a sort of extension of all of this, economically speaking, there's a lot greater social equality and a lot greater economic equality in New England than in Virginia. Here's a typical map of a New England town showing that everybody lives together in town, so we're clustered all in town. And then outside town would be fields. Everybody else would have lots where they go and they plant. There would be a meeting house, a government place where you pass laws and meet. Religion would take place in the meeting house if there wasn't a separate church. There'd be a common training ground in the middle, a green. Everything would sort of be done in common, close-knit, tight-knit world, kind of where you can keep an eye on your neighbors to make sure that they love Jesus just like they're supposed to. Well, these people are so intent on being perfect and making a utopia that there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree, and there is. In fact, there are a lot of dissenters in the Puritan world, a lot of people who don't agree on what the Puritans are doing and the way they're doing it. First of the dissenters to really speak of is Anne Hutchinson, who said God was speaking to her. She started teaching men and women out of her house, and eventually the Puritans banished her, largely because she violated gender norms, because she was a strong-willed woman who didn't take anything from any man. She thought pretty much, she had a relationship with God, and that gave her the right to speak on God's behalf as well as any guy could. Then there's Roger Williams, who called for separation of church and state, thinking, that God does not want your religion and your government to be mixed. The Puritans said, nope, shut up, get out. And he is banished, and he becomes the founder of Rhode Island, which is a radical place of freedom in early America, where there is a separation of church and state. Then there's Thomas Hooker, who wanted stricter church membership and disagreed with how the Puritans in Massachusetts were governing. So he took a group and they founded Connecticut. Puritans, you might think of as religious people, would be sort of kind and quiet, holy rolling, Bible thumping, no violence. But in fact, they were capable of quite terrible violence. In relationship to natives, for example, they do very poorly at trying to convert Indian peoples. And in fact, there are 2 wars against natives. In 1636, in an effort to get the land away from the Pequots, Puritans basically attack and eliminate this tribe and sell them into slavery. In 1675, Indians who were fed up with these holy rolling, do-gooding, land-stealing Puritan people are led by King Philip or Metacomb to attack the Puritans. And you can tell what Philip's hatreds are, because one of the first things they do is they kill cows, because cows walk in Indian fields and trample their food. And then in one place they actually kill a guy and stuff his Bible into his bowels. as if to say, take that. That's what we think of your religion. One of the most spectacular examples of violence, indeed murder, is the Salem witchcraft trials, in which the Puritans are willing to go to the extent of executing people because of their religious beliefs. And we'll talk more about that since you have some readings on that. Here is the title page of the Up Biblum God, the Puritan New Testament translated into the Algonquian Indian language by John Eliot. So there's some attempt to convert natives. The Puritans actually did put an Indian on their seal of Massachusetts. This is the Sigillum Gubernator et Societate de Massachusetts Bay in Nova Anglia. And this Indian is saying, come over and help us. Mostly this seal was done as a propaganda effort to get people to invest in Massachusetts Bay for the noble work of converting the Indians, though the Puritans have a really poor record of actually converting native peoples. Here is a map of New England in the 1640s showing native folks and the settlements of England, New England, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island. So all of these native peoples were here. The Pequots are down here. And then King Philip's people, the Narragansetts, are here. Here's an illustration of the massacre of the Pequots. This is in today what's called Mystic, Connecticut. The Indians were in a palisade with a fence with spikes all around it, holed up in there, and the Puritans actually set it on fire and executed the native peoples, burned them out. The ones who fled and ran out to get away from being burned alive were shot down by English people. Here is an illustration of the attack of King Philip's Indians, the Narragansetts, as they attacked Connecticut and Rhode Island, mostly this area right here. A little less so over in Connecticut. It was particularly violent and brutal. In the end, Philip is killed. His wife and child are actually sold into slavery, and he is executed. And there is Philip from a 19th century illustration. He became popular in a stage play in the 1830s that traveled the United States just as the U.S. is debating Indian removal. And the Salem witch trials, which we shall talk more about very soon. And a map of who's a witch, who's a defender, who's an accuser that we will look at in our discussions of the article that you read.